You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 15, Food for the Afterlife. In this episode, we'll explore what the dead eat and the many things that archaeologists have learned from the food, cookware, paintings, and statues that have been left with them. From the offerings that were acts of love, symbols of status, or provisions for a long journey beyond the grave, to the feasts that were held for the mourners to eat in remembrance for the dead, we'll explore several ways that people have incorporated food to connect the world of the living and the world of the dead. Now, let's dig in. Many cultures, both ancient and modern, include food in their burial practices. For some, it's because they view the afterlife as a continuation of their present life, which includes the need for food and drink. So the mourners will provide the supplies necessary for their loved one to go through the afterlife. Or for some, it's a status symbol to be buried with large quantities of delicacies, showing that they were so wealthy in life that they can continue to have luxury goods in the afterlife as well. For others, the food is an offering to the gods, with the deceased acting as the messenger on behalf of the living. Some funeral rituals include feasts for the mourners to eat as they come together to remember the dead. Thankfully for archaeologists, we can learn a lot about the food of ancient cultures thanks to their desire to provision the deceased for the afterlife and feast in their honor. One of the most obvious things that these foods can tell us is what the diet staples and cooking methods were for these cultures. In ancient Egypt, there was a belief that food is needed to sustain the soul in the afterlife. There was even a ritual called the opening of the mouth ritual, which was a symbolic rebirth so that the dead could eat, drink, see, and breathe, or otherwise function in every way they did in life in the afterlife. This meant that they would be buried with the foods that they had in life, though most royal and very elite tombs would have included luxury foods that wouldn't have been accessible to the general public. But we can still tell with the foods that are in the tombs, based off of what's most commonly in every tomb, the types of grains that were used most commonly in bread, the bread types, the tomb cheese that had made some internet fame a while back can teach us about the methods that were used for making cheese and what types of animals' milk was used for making cheese as well. The tomb cheese was about 3,200 years old, and it was found in the tomb of an official named Tamales, and it was actually a mixture of sheep's and goat's milk that was used to make this cheese. And interestingly, it actually had traces of a bacteria that causes essentially a type of food poisoning that you can get specifically from dairy. And it would have had pretty harsh symptoms like a fever, muscle aches. It's still fairly common today in places where you drink raw milk or things like that, or if there's cheese that's not stored properly. So it's very interesting that this is one of the oldest examples of this bacteria that causes this dairy-specific food poisoning. So we can learn a lot more than just about the dietary staples, but we can also learn about the bacteria that would have affected people back then. And what else do mummies eat? Mummified meat. And while that was an accidental rhyme and sounds like a popsicle stick pun, it has been found in several tombs of elites, most specifically Yuya and Tuya and King Tut from the New Kingdom. Their tombs were found with quite a lot of mummified meat, which was butchered and processed as if it were going to be served at a feast. Preparations were began, but then instead of completing the process and serving it for a feast, the meat was then mummified, wrapped in linens and everything, and provided coffins that were in the shape of the meat. So, for example, if it was a haunch of beef, it would have had a little coffin that was the shape of the haunch of beef. And this was to provision those elites with this feast food in the afterlife, and it would last much longer because by the New Kingdom, they would have experienced tombs that had old, rotting food in it from the previous generations before them. These meat mummies are one of the 3 types of mummies found in Egyptian tombs. There's meat mummies or victual mummies or food mummies. Those 3 terms tend to be used interchangeably. And then there's the sacrificial mummies, which would have been animals sacrificed on behalf of the petitioner to send a message to the gods, to direct line give the gods their prayer. Those would have been preserved in their whole body the same way that humans were, and then buried in a special coffin. So that's how we know that these bits of meat were meant to be food and not animal offerings. And then the 3rd type is, of course, human mummies. But what were the ancient Egyptians supposed to do when they were in the eternal afterlife and they ran out of the prepared food that they had taken with them at the time of their death? Well, early First Dynasty pharaohs would have had their servants sacrificed with them when they died in order to continue to serve them in the afterlife. But luckily, Egyptians very quickly realized that this was not a good practice, and they figured out a different way to continue to be served in the afterlife with servant statues. These were little limestone or wooden figurines that some were very, very detailed and showed people baking, brewing beer, harvesting, planting grain, and herding animals. In some tombs, there's entire scenes of a stable and cattle going into the stable. Sometimes there's miniature granaries. In one pre-dynastic tomb, there is a full-scale granary model that goes as part of the temple complex. So having more food to continue to sustain the elites and rulers in the afterlife was very important to ancient Egyptians. There would be tomb art with servants on them as well, but sometimes even recipes would be preserved specifically in tomb art. For example, on the wall of Ramses III's tomb, there's a recipe for spiral bread that's made with grape juice that's mixed into the batter. And it can still be followed today and made. I've made it before, and it tastes actually pretty good. In the tomb of Nakht, who was a scribe and astronomer for the Temple of Amun, around 1400 BCE, during the rule of Thutmose IV, he included a scene of the process for making wine on one of his tomb walls, completely from harvest to bottling. So his tomb has preserved the entire process for how the ancient Egyptians made wine around 1400 BCE. And presumably this was so that he could specifically continue to have access to wine in the afterlife for himself. So thankfully, we can now study this because he wanted to be provisioned eternally. And it's not only ancient Egypt that we can learn this information, though obviously as an Egyptologist, this is what I know more about. But in the Kofun period in Japan, for example, which was from about 250 CE until 538 CE with the introduction of Buddhism, there were these large earthen mound tombs that were used, and they give the period the name Kofun. These kofun are keyhole-shaped earthen mounds that were very large tombs for emperors and members of the royal family. Because these tombs were for people of elite status, they hold a lot of information from the time period because they hold a lot of artifacts. a lot of the stuff is going to be the typical shiny jewelry and things expected of the tombs from emperors, but there's also everyday things like pottery and plates and cookware. And in several of the tombs specifically, there's cookware found that, based on the shape of it and the residue found within it, they found ancient rice steamers within some of these tombs. So while there's archaeological evidence of rice being a very important staple diet as far back as time immemorial in Asia, it's very interesting to find these artifacts that prove specific cooking methods. And it's the same shape as rice cookers are today if you were to go and buy an electric rice cooker. Another example is from Mesoamerica, or modern-day Central America. We know that maize was a widespread food staple and very, very important to the entire region and a lot of South America as well. But grave goods can tell us how different cultures cooked it and served it. One example is Mayan pottery and burial offerings that include tamales. So the oldest representations and most frequent representations of tamales come from Mayan pottery, and therefore that can tell us that tamales originated in Mayan culture and might have been specifically for ceremonial, ritual, or only special occasions. Similar to how today they're more widespread around Christmas time. And it wasn't just food for the deceased that has been found and archaeologists have been able to analyze. The Minoans of Crete, for example, buried unique tripod cooking pots with their dead. The Minoans of Crete were a culture that was before the Greeks and contemporary to the Mycenaeans, but their culture was almost completely wiped out by a major volcanic eruption that happened on the Isle of Thera and destroyed quite a lot of Crete and damaged almost everything that was left of them. So by about 50 years later, after the eruption, there were almost no Minoans left other than refugees who had left and gone to some of the other isles or the mainland. But many of their archaeological sites that archaeologists work on today, there's tombs that have survived, and unique tripod cooking pots were found buried with the dead. But the evidence shows that these were used to prepare the funeral feast, and the mourners would take part in that. And then that special pot would be buried with the dead. Now, the pot wasn't only for funerals, this tripod cooking pot. It's been found in temple areas and palace areas as well. So it seems to have been an elite thing and could possibly be like a show of wealth, similar to the ancient Egyptians who would have massive food stores as their shows of wealth. And as a bonus, it can be used to feed all of the mourners who have come together to honor the dead. In addition to these cooking pots for the feasts, food offerings for the deceased as well have been found in Minoan burials. These are just a few of the many, many, many examples of how archaeologists have been able to learn about food staples and cooking methods from the tombs that they've excavated. And there are other things that can be learned as well, and not just about the food itself. I'll delve into those right after this. In addition to learning about the food itself, archaeologists can also learn about crafting techniques or storage techniques or preservation techniques from the materials that are used in order to store the food that's used for food offerings. Baskets and jars and vases and amphora, and there's so many different terms for it all. They can have information on where the materials came from that it was used based off of different chemical analyses that can be done, or even just looking through microscopes to try to see certain structures and identify plant materials, for example. Or some of these can have artistic designs that provide more information and cultural context. For example, a lot of the tombs from the Aegean Sea area, like Minoan and Mycenaean, and then later Greek, and all sorts of cultures all around that region, have a lot of mythology that's depicted on a lot of their vases. Some of those stories haven't passed down in the written tales that have made it to us. Some of the imagery that's used is imagery that is vaguely attested to one god, so they can identify that, but they don't necessarily know what story is being told there because there's no explanation of it. But at the very least, they can see that iconography, and eventually more and more finds can build up and maybe fill in the pieces of that puzzle. And different types of sealants used to attempt to preserve food for as long as possible can be tested, and that can be studied as well, just from the jars and materials that have been left behind in order to store all of these food offerings. And they can also teach us about trade networks and even human migration paths. The tomb of Scorpion King in Abydos from 3320 BCE, roughly, had grapes in it from modern-day Palestine. This is very good evidence of long-distance trade, but also strong diplomatic ties to be able to get such large quantities of a luxury food item that was not able to grow in Egypt at the time. Grapes were not native to the area. They were transplanted much, much later, 2 to 3 centuries later, maybe even 4. And so this would have been a very luxurious item to have in life, let alone mass quantities of it in death. The tomb of Merneith, also from the same time period, the first woman to rule in her own right without a king, her tomb recently in one of the chambers that hadn't been found by looters, archaeologists found it and discovered there were thousands of wine jars. Thousands that would have contained tons of wine that were buried with her for the afterlife. And as I mentioned, how materials can tell us where a place was made, that can also show us trade networks. If, for example, you have a basket that is made from materials that do not grow in the area it was found, you'll know that either the materials or the basket itself made whole, which is the more likely option, came from a different area, and you can tell where based off of the plant fibers that were used. And on an even larger scale, pottery that was found in very, very old tombs dating back to the Chalcolithic period and the very beginning of the Bronze Age, the bell beaker culture, which is named for the bell-shaped beakers that are found in a lot of the tombs that would have held drinks and food to go with the person into the afterlife, and possibly were used in life as well and weren't just made for burial purposes. This pottery can be used to trace the spread of copper metallurgy into Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and that mass migration slowly over time can be tracked because of these pottery pieces that have been found, and because of the importance to provision the dead in the afterlife. The earliest copper mine and smelting operation in Northwest Europe is found at Ross Island in Ireland, and here there's bell beaker pottery, as well as essentially a fully operational mine and smelting camp with no evidence of the evolution of this technology taking place here. Both of these pieces point towards this being the place where the bell beakers came from the mainland and then taught the locals here how to mine the copper and how to smelt it. Most likely, they had already seen the copper. Copper veins are very often on the surface, and the research done here has shown that they wouldn't have been very deep. So all of the bell beaker people had to do was essentially ask the locals, hey, have you seen these shiny rocks? and they would have been shown, and most likely they exchanged this technology, and it wasn't any sort of hostile takeover based off of the artifacts that have been found there. While weapons were found there, they were found in the process of being made from after the smelted copper, and not in a sense of this was a battlefield or any sort of armory or something that needed to be heavily guarded. And another interesting thing about the Ross Island copper is it's not completely pure, and its chemical trace can be tested, and it's unique enough that it can be identified in many early tools that actually spread across Europe from this place as the metallurgy technology itself was still spreading, not as quickly as the need for copper tools was spreading. And it's amazing that all of that can be initially traced because of food containers. These food containers and the food offerings and even just depictions of feasts can also provide information on the social status of the deceased as well as social norms of the time period. Feasting relationships are fundamental to structuring power relationships within communities. They are essentially the very early version of a parliament or a council of sorts, because it was over feasts that political and major social decisions would have happened. And therefore, tombs that show feasting scenes that include these types of political discussions can tell us a great deal, like Etruscan tomb art, which shows women included in the feasts that included prominent politicians until much later into their period under Roman rule. And while the Etruscan tombs show us a little closer to equality, on the flip side, we have Egyptian tombs, which can show us some pretty egregious or very large scale asks and displays of royal power, such as within the temple of Ramses III, the same Ramses III who had the bread recipe. There are records for the daily preparation of over 2,000 loaves of bread, 144 jars of beer, 100 bundles of vegetables, 30 birds of various kinds, 10 fruit baskets, and 4 liters of honey that were to be prepared daily as offerings to the king. And evidence suggests that this did actually continue for quite some time after the royal's death, and was maintained by a mortuary cult dedicated to the king that would have operated out of his mortuary temple near his tomb. In Scandinavia, especially in the Viking Age and just before it, there was a belief that the dead would go to feast halls, either Valhalla or Folkvanger, and this is reflected in their burials as well. Feast halls were central political and social gathering places in Scandinavian culture, again, in the Viking era and long before it came along as well. So then feast animals would be buried with wealthy and prominent community leaders, and this would be a show that they could provide the feasts because it would be their responsibilities in order to provide the food for these feasts using either their own hunting skills, their own wealth, tributes from the people who look up to them and respect them, or in some cases fear them. Whatever means they have of getting the food in order to provide for these feasts, they would do so. And so in having these, they would have entire animals such as cattle and boars and all sorts of birds and things that would be included in feasts, buried with them, so that they could be shown as being able to provide in the afterlife as well. Even though obviously either Freya or Odin would have plenty to provide for them while they await Ragnarok, it's still kind of a show of faith that the ruler or leader in this case can still provide. Many tombs around the Mediterranean region will have feasting scenes up on the walls, either in the tombs or in the mortuary temples in the case of ancient Egypt. And these can also give some context as to what the social norms for food offerings would be as well, based on what's painted there. And in some cases, the food that is left or not left, in this case, in tombs, can provide us evidence of famine or some other natural disaster that would have disrupted the food supply. There are several cultures who increased their symbolic food offerings and decreased real food offerings in times that have proven to coincide with times of famine. In Egypt, for example, during the first intermediate period, there are records stating that a widespread famine was so bad that some places were resorting to cannibalism. Even taking a step back and saying that that official might have been being a little bit dramatic, there was still obviously a very bad famine going on. And during this period, we also see an increase in fake food being inserted in tombs, and even more of these servant statues being made in order to serve this fake food. It would be things like stone versions of carved foods, like a stone goose that's already been plucked and prepared for cooking, or things like offering tables with foods carved into them, or tomb art that would include lots and lots and lots of images of food that weren't previously as abundant before in older reliefs and paintings. And in Mesoamerica, there are times where Mayan pottery and tombs increase with painted food offerings, especially painted tamales on pottery or on walls. And this coincides often with times of famine that can be found in the paleoecological record based on environmental studies that have been done. In some rare instances, such as in the Inca, we actually see an increase in real food being offered to the gods in response to a famine, and this seems to be basically people offering their very best option possible to the gods in hopes that they will respond to their prayers and provide them with the rain that would be needed in order to continue to have crops. Otherwise, the food that they have left ultimately wouldn't matter if people die of famine anyways, and therefore offering it to the gods seems a better alternative. And there are many more nuanced things that can come from studying foods across different regions. Little tiny things like the environment, like small temperature changes, to large scale changes such as volcanic winters, or things like the differences in rainy seasons or some climate shifts, or even sometimes times of political upheaval if there's evidence of large amounts of fields being burned all around roughly the same time. And whether it's for the deceased or those in mourning, food is an important part of the cycle of both life and death. It sustains us in life and is often a part of our death rituals. Whether it's meant to nourish the soul or honor the gods or comfort the grieving, these meals connect the living and the dead across time. Thank you for joining me for this episode about food in the afterlife. I don't know about you, but it has made me very hungry thinking about all of these foods. I hope everyone who's listening has some tasty meals. The next episode will take a look at Boudica and the archaeological evidence for her in her time period, even though her tomb itself hasn't been found yet. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the Past Macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at ArchPodNet.com/members. That's ArchPodNet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.